Judge Edward Rogers.
Here.
Manuel Farrar. Robin Fiore. Present. Ronald Harvey. Here. Bruce Reinhardt. Michael McCall.
Here.
Terry Powell.
We have a quorum. As you're in the meeting, ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of the meeting today, I guess it looks like we're talking pretty much to all family, but I think that we're the ones who are in need of enlightenment as well. So the purpose of the meeting here is for us to have a little more information about the working of the Inspector General's Committee and its relationship with the Committee on Ethics so that we can understand a little more about it. And it's going to take a few more meetings like this because I know that I'm in the position here wearing two hats, and sometimes I can't keep one on properly. So I'm trying to find out a little more about what we do, what our relationship is with one another, and whether or not there are any conflicts and how we handle them. So we've invited with some of the midwives here, for lack of a better term, to explain what they had in mind for us here. So we're going to call the meeting to order, and I'd like to welcome everybody here. Thank you for coming here, and thank those of you who are on the Origination Committee for coming. And we will start. Inspector, did you want to make any opening statements or anything like that?
I just welcome everybody, and we look forward to a brief meeting. I understand you have a very large meeting after this one, so we're okay. And
all right, and thank you very much for coming. All right, first on the meeting is a presentation of the ordinance changes. Who's going to do that? And Mr. Berger, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for having me. This shouldn't take too long, and I think most of you already experienced some of what your duties are. We thought it would be a pretty good idea to give you the full range of what it is you're expected to do as the Inspector General Committee, as opposed to just the smaller Ethics Commission. You have three general broad duties. One is selecting and deciding whether to retain the Inspector General. You've done that once already. The other is receiving periodic reports from the IG's office. You've done that once already, so you know what that's like. And the third is participating in the removal procedure, and hope that you never have to do that. But in the event that that ever occurs, it is worth a minute or two to talk about it. First, as to selection, our Human Resources Department provided the staff for this initially. The ordinance says that you can continue to use the Human Resources Department for this in the future if you like, or you can use your own staff. And what your own staff means is something that I want to get back to at the end of this presentation, because I think it also bears a little bit of thought today. Once selected, a designee from the Commission on Ethics, along with the County Attorney's Office and the HR Department, negotiates the contract for employment with the IG. And it's on terms that are substantially similar to other contract employees with the county. And the County Commission ultimately approves that this is a county contract. It is for a term of 4 years. And at the end of the 4 years, it is the Inspector General Committee's job to determine whether or not to retain the IG for an additional 4 years or not. That decision has to come from you 6 months at least before the end of the term. If my math is correct, I believe your term began on the 28th of June. You probably remember that date, 2010. So Ms. Steckler will need to have her notice no later than the 28th of December 2013. I'm not telling you to mark it on your calendars now, but it is something obviously that you will need to be kept in the loop on. In the event of vacancies, you all are called upon to fill the vacancy pursuant to our selection process as soon as you can. There are exact time frames that are laid out in the ordinance, and I think I provided them to you as excerpts in the materials that I prepared. You can also appoint one of the members of the IG staff to serve as interim. Reporting, like I already mentioned, every 6 months you'll convene to receive a report from the Inspector General. You'll hear of her review of what happened the last 6 months and her planned activities for the future, as her objectives and goals as well. This is how removal works, and this is the final thing to really discuss far as your powers and duties are concerned. Absent some kind of felony conviction or something like that, the only way that the IG can be removed is for cause, and that cause listed in the ordinance is neglect of duty, abuse of power or authority, discrimination, or ethical misconduct. Now, there is a two-step process that is required for the removal, and I think it's best if we think about it in terms of the two steps. First, there's what I'll call the initiation phase, and then there's the removal, the public hearings for the actual removal. In order to initiate the process, either the Board of County Commissioners, the Inspector General Committee, or what we have called a funding entity has to find by a supermajority vote that there is cause to remove the IG. A funding entity, I'll mention only briefly, is any entity that contracts with the IG, so an entity other than the county or one of the cities whose budget or whose services with the IG amounts to 25% of the budget of the Inspector General. It is kind of a mythical creature to date. There are very few possible entities who could fit that bill. For the time being, we don't really need to worry about the funding entity. Another way to initiate the removal process, any municipality can petition for removal as well. In order for that to happen, a supermajority of the municipality by resolution would have to decide that there is cause to remove the Inspector General. The city would submit a petition to the Inspector General's office, the General Counsel there, who would then forward the petition to you all again, the Inspector General Committee, and you would determine whether it merits initiating the removal process. So there are two ways that the Inspector General Committee can initiate removal, either of their own volition or by a petition that they would approve coming from one of the municipalities. Once it's initiated, the board that decides to initiate, and it can be either the County Commission or you all, must send that notice along with the specific charges to the Inspector General at least 60 days prior to the removal hearings. And the removal hearings are done separately by each entity. So you all have to have your own removal hearing, and the County Commission has to have its own removal hearing. And if there is such a thing as a funding entity one day, they will have to have theirs as well. The IG will have an opportunity to be heard at the hearing. If this is one of those that was initiated through a municipal petition, the municipality is guaranteed an opportunity to be heard at the hearing as well. And the removal requires a supermajority vote of each of the entities. So after the hearing, you would all have to, by supermajority, determine that removal was appropriate. County Commission would as well. And if there's ever a funding entity out there, they would have to also. And that is all of your duties under the ordinance. But I want to mention for you to think about for the future what the concept of staff is. This requires going back to the beginning of the ordinance when we first drafted this. And I'll tell you, when we drafted this at the very beginning, there really wasn't even a selection committee. The Commission on Ethics was the committee that selected the Inspector General. And frankly, in our limited view, before it ran through the gauntlet of various interest groups and agencies who made multiple amendments to it, in our view, the Commission on Ethics staff was the staff to your group for doing these various activities. It may or may not be appropriate now for that to be the case. I believe that Cheryl called this meeting and acted as staff in this context. But a couple of things to think about. We ought to nail it down, and not today. I would suggest maybe agendaing it for your next 6-month review to really discuss what the appropriate way of doing this is. There could be some uncomfortable situations if the IG staff served as staff for the committee. In the event of a removal procedure, you wouldn't want this staff dealing with it. Frankly, even in a if you all determine not to renew the term of the sitting IG, that IG can still apply for the job. Again, you'd be having that person's staff in charge of running the process, which also might be a little uncomfortable for you. The county's Human Resources Department, I think, is certainly excellently equipped to do that function, and I doubt that there's any smart reason why either the IG's office or the Commission on Ethics office should have that kind of expertise. on staff for what amounts to a once every 4-year exercise. So there are certain things that really need to be considered, and I recommend that maybe we talk about it, if Cheryl's okay with it, at the next 6-month meeting, give it some thought in the meantime, and maybe all the staffs can have some proposals for you all to consider.
All right, does anybody have any questions?
So our staffing issue comes down to 3 alternatives. Hello. The staffing issue comes down to 3 alternatives: using county staff, using IG staff, or using ethics commission staff. Is that correct? And we're talking about just sitting as a larger body as the
Correct.
IG committee.
And only for the 3 functions that I described now.
Okay, anything else?
Are there any arguments articulated thus far against using county staff?
All I can, from an institutional history perspective, as this was moving through the adoption phase, there was great interest in trying to maintain the independence of the Inspector General's office and the Commission on Ethics as much as humanly possible.
So it becomes an independence discussion.
So right, it's a question of independence. At some point, again, I certainly don't think that there's any wisdom in having a 4th staff out there just for the limited purpose, and I'm not sure what all you could do for that our Human Resources Department does. It is quite an undertaking to engage in the kind of search that yielded Ms. Steckler here, for example, and to go outside for that would also be pretty costly to hire an independent firm.
All right, Mr. I have a couple here. Number one, I find myself being in a sort of a schizophrenic nightmare, being an initiating staff of an indictment or something, and also the trier of it. This seems a little void of due process to me for us to be able to initiate a removal procedure, and then we listen to what we initiated. I think that's a little problem
I think
for me
that the
there.
purpose of it, when we began down this road, was to, the initiation process is almost like a grand jury. There is really, it's whether that, based on what you've seen, there's some cause to begin the process. But at that point, there's no opportunity for the Inspector General to bring any kind of defense. We, again, originally saw this as a one-step process, frankly. And again, the concept of wanting to ensure as much functional independence as possible is what made this evolve into this 2-step process to make it a little more difficult for the removal.
Okay. I think also the other question is, it appears to me as though you sort of throw us under the bus whenever you say you determine what the salary is. Then when the raise matter comes up, you say to us, this is your job, and the newspapers wonder, well, why are you giving raises and things like that? I'd like to know from your clarification is, you determine what the salary is, which is fair because it's the county's money. But perhaps you, the county's human resource or whoever does it, should also determine, make the decision as to whether or not the raise is a proper one, because that's also the county's money. And we found ourselves a little embarrassed with Al whenever we were told before, you have nothing to do with the money. You just hire him, tell us who you want, we negotiate the salaries. But then when he asked for a raise, he flipped it back to us. Is that still the situation here?
Yeah, and we can look to the ordinance and decide, or even the way the ordinance is written, you could still, I suppose, look to staff for looking at common salary ranges. But right now, I think the ordinance has you firmly under the bus.
Okay. Yeah, just, okay. Same thing?
To finish, and I'll make a couple comments on your comment.
Okay, one more question, you want to do it now?
No.
Okay, the other question I had, we expected to do an evaluation or a report by December the 28th on how this is working out?
What it is that you all have the authority to determine whether or not you want to keep the seating IG for an additional 4-year term. This will happen for you in December of 2013. And you are the entity who determines who to hire and whether or not to continue to retain them.
But did you not say that on the 28th of December. We have to make-
2013.
Oh,
of
2013,
yeah.
okay, I'm sorry.
Time to worry about.
Okay. And are there any timelines for us to make an evaluation of her office or anything like that before we present this report, or?
Well, I think that probably plays into the need for having someone you can call a staff to try to perhaps establish procedures and review parameters even. The idea behind having 6-month reports that you get now is for you to be able to gauge every 6 months throughout a 4-year term how the office is progressing.
Would that
Okay.
include an external review? An external reviewer?
We don't have one, but if that's something you'd like to talk about, we could consider it perhaps at the next meeting.
The ordinance has the annual report tied to the ordinance right now ties the annual report to any performance increase, which now we've moved that annual report from an annual, because we started in July, to the end of December, so it could be with the calendar or the fiscal year of the county. So that's what's in the ordinance right now.
All right, sir?
On the two-step process to initiate... No, sorry. No. On a two-step process to initiate removal, it was done purposely to provide a check, just a check in the process, because the thought was you didn't want a covered entity to have the sole ability to initiate a removal proceeding. What happens if the IG does something that's unpopular or particularly, controversial? I'm not saying that she will or the office will, but you didn't want a covered entity to have an open path, even by a supermajority vote, to initiate removal proceedings with an unhappy covered entity / client partner. And so this larger committee is designed to be a bit of that buffer. It also is the body that ultimately makes at least the largest part of a decision about evaluating the IG, whether to rehire the IG, how to select the new IG. So it is functionally the oversight body, distant as that is, over the watchdog entity. And so that's why it's a two-step process. It's just a check that you could stop the removal on the front end if this body didn't think that it was it met a threshold merit of having to be vetted. Under the Rays scenario, I think, how is the ordinance written now in terms of, I know the Ethics Commission handles the executive director and staff issues in terms of compensation. How is the IG ordinance
committee.
written?
At the time of the annual report, the IG committee.
Okay, so at the time of the annual report, this body then acts. And I think the idea, Mr. Chair, is a similar one in that you didn't want to have a covered entity making qualitative decisions about the watchdog personnel. So we end up being, again, that somewhat of a governing or oversight of the IG.
All right, sir. Mr. Pratt?
Mr. Berger, I presume that the HR department of the county doesn't have a whole lot of experience in hiring or evaluating IGs. Okay.
None.
And obviously I was being facetious. Presuming we were to use the HR department to evaluate General Steckler, how would we go about doing that?
And I didn't mean to suggest that. It was only to use them in the same context that you did for the original selection. They send
A
out
search
they send out
situation.
this- right.
Okay.
They do the search,
All right.
they do background checks, they do, and they administer the selection process. You all were, and will continue to be, solely charged with making the selection.
How is this committee supposed to evaluate General Steckler in an objective fashion and also a public, transparent fashion? What rules, procedures, what methodologies do we have?
None. And that's why it's important to think about the concept of a staff for those kinds of exercises. I mean, clearly Ms. Steckler has her work plan out, and how well she meets it is something you'll hear about every 6 months. How you choose to evaluate it you may choose to evaluate it in another way, or you may not be fond of that particular work plan, and you may need some staff to assist in evaluating that, to be sure. But there is nothing
I'm almost
there.
going to feel like Justice Scalia here. I'm going to ask to see if you can give us sort of the intent of the folks who put together the IG ordinance, in the sense that how was the IG selection committee supposed to evaluate General Steckler? Or did we get that far?
We did not get that far.
Okay. Would there be a problem if we, the IG selection committee, received input from several areas, the HR department of the county, General Steckler herself, outside sources, the movers and shakers who put together this entire ethics initiative, multiple sources, and then vetted it amongst the public?
I
can't think of a reason why that would be a problem. I'm just
Yeah.
asking.
No,
Okay.
and that could be part of what is covered at the next 6-month meeting.
And rules and procedures, do we make those up?
What I would recommend is, once we arrive on a appropriate staffing component for you, that you work with that staff to come up with those procedures.
Okay, Mr. McAuliffe, did you have another statement?
I did. As a participant in those discussions, the idea was that this body is the check and the oversight of oversight, but not in a traditional, we can't dock her pay, we can't determine her staffing, we cannot determine her agenda. This is consultative in nature. That is, we sit and give her, that office, a wide berth for conduct and activities. And I think the latest generation of the IG ordinance that was passed by the BCC and applies to the municipalities purposely, we wanted some structural linkage in terms of communication and interaction, and that's why you have the 6-month reporting. But it is not going to be, at least in my view, a traditional governance.
And I didn't mean to suggest that it was, but in fairness to General Steckler, I presume the target of any of her investigations are not going to be very happy. So it's just the nature of the beast. So in fairness to her and to her office and to the entire ethics initiative, we should have, in my opinion, some criteria where General Steckler can point to and say, we're doing this, we're doing that, or whatever, so that the office is defended from what I would consider to be unfair attacks. And I didn't mean to insist that the IG selection committee sits as management for the IG, and that's not what I grasp from the ordinance. But it is only fair to the general, and it's only fair to the public that we know what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay. If I could,
Dr. Fiore, let me hear from her, please.
A couple of points. I have a mic on. I feel as though this is getting very personalized. It's about General Steckler, and I don't want it to be about General Steckler. So one of the things is that we should all talk about the IG's office, I think, and look at the work product specifically. I think people can be happy with your process and unhappy with your conclusion. So what I would be looking for about input is about your process. If your conclusions are appealed and overturned, then we'll know something about your conclusions as well, but I want to look at the processes. There's two things going on here. One is an annual review, as I understand it, for salary purposes, and one is the 4-year renewal. Is that correct?
not today.
No?
No, not today, just in general.
No, I'm saying we're talking about two kinds of review. One is managerial in that it's about salary. And the 4-year review, though, is the one that evaluates the office and the work product as a renewal question. And so for that one, I do think that we need to incorporate into the budget for you an external review to advise us as to what your office has accomplished in the 4 years. This is fairly typical of, yes, it's right here. It's as high as I can get it. Better? So an external review from another IG office, that sort of thing. So we have 4 years to talk about it, or 3 years to talk about it, but that's a different kind of evaluation or a different kind of input than the annual or 6-monthly reviews that we're doing. So for the renewal question, we need a lot more data, and we need someone to actually be responsible for collecting that data and organizing that data.
Okay.
That's outside the IG's office, I think.
Mr. Roberts, let me hear from the inspector.
If I may, there's going to be two types of reviews that are going to be going on also. We have peer review in the audit side every 3 years, and then we're seeking accreditation, which will mean an accreditation review every 3 years as well. So this office will be double reviewed in those two formats.
Yeah, my only comment was going to be, overall, our considerations, or at least mine, would be to protect the independence of the office. That's, I think, paramount of importance. And it's really up to us as to how resourceful we are to go get whatever information we need. And I think those are two great points, that there'll be a lot of it right in there. But I mean, if we wanted to use HR for certain tasks and go somewhere else for other tasks, then that's up to us how we do that.
All right, basically, Mr. Berger, we could use a little more distance under the bus. So as you review your plans for making things a little easier, then we'd appreciate a little more guidance. All right, next, Mr. Richard Radcliffe from the League of Municipalities, an update.
Okay, briefly, just a correction, the funding is not with the county. It originally was with the county in entirety, but now the cities provide just under 50% of the funding. I just want a correction there. Also, there is a review we have, I believe, with the Palm Beach County Commission once a year. There is no real teeth to it, but it is in the ordinance, and I believe it's in July. There's a meeting that takes place with the League of Cities and the Palm Beach County Commission over budgetary review. Doesn't say what happens at that, but that does happen. But an update of where we are, we've created a system overnight, and originally the cities had, we had a whole bureaucracy appear overnight, and we had to deal with it, and the cities were very frightened. We weren't sure what was going on. And over the course of time, the Inspector Generals worked very, very well together. We've met on one occasion that Judge Rogers actually initiated for us to sit down, and it was a wonderful event. We sat down, we got a lot of small minor points back and forth, and we were given some handouts which now have been distributed to the cities, and my phones have been quiet, very, very quiet, as it wasn't in the beginning, and my job has gotten a lot easier, and I can focus on a lot of other things. So hopefully we're moving in that direction. It's wonderful. It's evolutionary. I think this process is wonderful. I'm glad to be a part of it, and I appreciate the peace and quiet.
All right, sir. Any questions?
Could I have your telephone number?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll call you if you really need it.
Yeah, I got plenty to keep me busy.
Mr. Chair, I know that the grand jury report came out last week, and I know we touched on the expansion of the jurisdiction of the IG and the Ethics Commission to the municipalities. And from what I'm hearing, overall, overwhelmingly maybe, the municipalities are taking it to heart and if not embracing, at least engaging the IG, and over the long term, hopefully viewing it more as a partnership. I guess there's a small number of municipalities that just by either collective personality of governance or fear or maybe lack of knowledge about what the IG is actually meant to do and how it is supposed to help them do their jobs. I've heard some pushback, and the grand jury heard some pushback as reflected in the presentment. What you recommend that either you can do or we can do together to help those municipalities work through those issues?
Well, I think it's, to a great degree, there's an education process, and that's what I'm seeing happen. I mean, people didn't realize there's 3 separate divisions. People were coming in and going to be audited, and they were frightened that they were being investigated. Well, that throws fear throughout everyone. So we've initiated a lot of checks and balances. We've also worked on ways of engagement when they first enter the city, and it's going to be an evolutionary process. Just like your advisory opinions here, I come and watch, and it's evolving. We're going to be leading the state. We may be leading the country with what we're doing here, but there really isn't a lot of instructions for this. You know, it really is. It's similar to Miami-Dade, but we have created something very unique. So it's an evolutionary process, and I think what we're doing now is working well.
Well, we need the feedback, because what we don't understand, secrecy invites suspicion. And if we don't understand how it's working, we're inclined to be a little suspicious, because where your freedom begins, mine ends. So we'd like you to encourage them to come to the meetings from time to time to see what we're actually doing here. Okay, next is that Inspector General, you're going to give us your overview of procedures, the
Yes,
process of review?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of briefly take you through what happens when a complaint comes in, and this is a complaint in general or a complaint even about our office. Our system is set up that everything that comes in gets a number, and it gets put into a system, so it is a public record at the specific point in time. And if the complaint comes in, as I took you through in the 6-month review, if it's regarding a city or the county, depending on how we handle it as a review or an inquiry, we have a process that's outlined in our accreditation manual for that. If a complaint comes in about a staff member of our office or the office in general, that gets entered into the system. It then goes to the general counsel of our office and myself to review it for management purposes. If a complaint comes in about me personally, it does not go to me. It will go to the Inspector General, General Counsel, who will immediately get it to you all. And so that process is in place, and from there you all make the decision of how you want to have that handled.
That would be essentially an intake function only.
It's an intake function just to make sure that if it's about me personally and it's an abuse of power, neglect of duty, that it gets to you all. And that was something that we talked about through the drafting committee.
Therein lies the problem that I see. But we don't have it. Hopefully we won't even get to it. Are there any questions in particular about the overview process?
I had a question for
Yeah.
General Steckler. I'm sure you read very carefully State Attorney McCall's latest grand jury report. I was struck by one sentence in there. I'll quote it. Future efforts must focus on creating a mechanism to judge the reforms in practice. Help us, in effect, help the IG's office. What is it that we can do in order to create a structure that is fair to everyone involved, and also is transparent for the public's purposes?
And I don't have the report in front of me, but I think a lot of that, where I took from that, was about the measures. We've been talking about how do we measure this reform. And so one of the things we are doing is, now that I have my full executive team, we actually next month, after we sit through accreditation, we're going to be doing a strategic plan. We're going to be finalizing the performance measures. We actually have been talking with some to have some of our stakeholders at the table during that process. Because measuring reform is difficult. It's easy to measure a case number. It's easier to measure a dollar fix. It is difficult to measure the impact that we are seeing almost daily between policies and procedures changing, between contractors that, wasn't bid one time, now it's being bid. There's so much great reform happening that it's very difficult to put a measure to that. So we're going to be moving forward to try to capitalize that and be able to report that piece of it to the public. The annual report will be another big part of that, of how the money is coming in, how the money's spent, what we actually spent versus what we questioned in costs and recoveries. All that will be in that annual report that you'll be seeing shortly.
When do you expect to have the strategic plan in place?
Well, we're going to be going through the month of November and December, so hopefully by December we should see, at about the same time of this annual report, I hope to have our first version of that strategic plan solid and ready
the
to go.
plan is going to contain
Measures.
some form of matrices or measures or metrics or whatever you want to call it some way. Okay. And how do you measure an IG's office? I'm not aware. It's not widgets sold, obviously.
Yeah, I think you have to look at measuring activities is one part, but again, we've got to get our hands wrapped around the ethics reform, and that's where I think we'll call in some stakeholders, because that's a very difficult thing to do, because you're literally starting from a ground zero here, and the structure wasn't necessarily in place. And so we're taking a lot of time helping put structures in place. And that doesn't necessarily have a dollar value to it, but it has a value for future greater controls. So it's just, that's where we need to get, in addition to, you can certainly look at, number of cases we issue, number of audits we do, what are the impacts, we look at corrective actions. Do they actually make the changes that we requested they change, and does government get better? Those are all measures that you can look at.
What does your office suggest in terms of rules of procedure for this IG selection and oversight committee?
Rules of procedures for the...
As I understand it, we have no rules of procedure. Is that correct, Mr. Berger? That's correct. Okay.
I'm not sure.
And maybe it's the lawyer in me coming out, but sometimes the rules themselves have as much effect on an outcome as the actual rules. The way you implement the rules has an outcome as much as the rules do. So is there a procedure that your office might recommend as part of this strategic plan? Or how can we get to the point where the IG Selection Committee has rules of procedure much like the Ethics Commission does?
And help me understand, if you're talking about rules and procedures regarding the guidance of how this office operates, we have standards.
No, not how your office
Help me
operates,
understand.
how we would operate in case we received a complaint in terms of annual reviews.
Yeah, we'd have
As
to-
I understand it, there are none. Would we look to your office to draft those for us on a proposed basis? Should we do that ourselves? Would that be part of the strategic plan?
Well, I think the procedures are, what we have drafted now is that it comes to you, from there, there's a gap. So I think that's collectively, a lot of that would be for how you all also want to establish that procedure.
Okay. Well, it's, all right.
I'd have to put some thought, this is...
Okay, and I'm being unfair to you because I'm asking the
Yeah.
question cold, obviously. But Mr. Berger, any suggestions on that?
Again, I think that it would be, for whoever the staff ends up being, it is not too difficult to arrive at a set of procedures, say, for conducting a hearing. There's no
Conducting
reason to
reviews.
invent these out of whole cloth. At the county level, we have numerous quasi-judicial boards where there is, where we ensure that everyone's due process rights are met. You probably have the same thing for your own hearings, although, and you could probably adapt any of those fairly simply to this procedure. But it's a question, again, of who you want to charge with the responsibility of doing it. And again, we can probably bring it up and address it more fully with the advantage of a little forethought at the 6-month meeting.
Mr. Chair, I think what we should do is, I actually think it would be not appropriate to have the IG suggest IG removal internal procedures. I do think, though, we decide the staffing issue, who, if it ends up being county or maybe Ethics Commission. I mean, I'm not quite sure, but I think, it seems to me, I have a gut preference that it's the Ethics Commission staff that acts as the IG committee staff, but I hadn't thought it through. But we address the staffing issue, and then we can come up and just tailor some procedures. They're not going to be complicated or involved to give notice to the IG office as to what the procedure is. I think that's a great idea, and we'll wrap those two discussions together.
I actually would like to see it not be the Commission on Ethics staff. We're trying very hard to keep some daylight between the IG review committee and the Commission on Ethics.
Well, anyway, it's something that we do need to take a...
So I think someone from Mr. Berger's office might be more appropriate.
Well, I think we'll take some time to reflect on this. Clearly, when it comes to the HR function, my personal preference at this point, without further enlightenment, is to not have our staff involved in HR function. That's part involved, and the county does a good job, and I'm not concerned really that independence is impaired in any way by use of that staff for an HR function. With respect to procedures, and we have our own procedures right now with respect to due process and other matters, and clearly between the experiences of everyone else's in their offices, I think that we could construct whatever protocols needed for these things to to contain all the due process necessary. I did want to ask you, Inspector General, who do you envision as stakeholders? And you mentioned you might bring in stakeholders to discuss part of your metrics in your strategic planning process. Who do you envision some of those to be? And examples is fine. You don't have to be precise.
Well, certainly where this all began with the stakeholders that were involved in the whole ethics reform, we would reach out to that community.
Okay.
Between the, in fact, I saw Mike Jones peek in there here a minute ago, and I'd probably call a few members of the audience that are here today that can help us, because they have a great foresight of where this was to go and how we can measure some of the successes.
Mr. McAuliffe, do you want to be heard from it?
No, I think that's right. I think the business leadership community, I think the business community, I think that the ethics initiative, which used to be called the Ethics Coalition, those folks have been very productive and positive and have helped really provide the momentum for some of these reforms structurally, so I think that they should be involved. The grand jury report really, in essence, talked about some substantive issues that are pending, and it also weighed in, and I think Manny said it well, it's a critical part of this next chapter of the life of both the Ethics Commission and the IG to come up with a consensus set of benchmarks for performance, because that's what you then can be judged by. My personal or individual input is that those benchmarks need to be arrived in a consensus fashion as much as possible, because then everyone then accepts the performance measures.
Have you been able to categorize a specific section, like we all represent different sections of the community, and has the pushback been greater in one section, or there's more activity in one section, like municipalities or law enforcement or the attorneys or anything, more so than another, and anything that the Commission on Ethics could do in the way of education to assist you in this matter?
I think, like when we started with the county, there was a lot of nervousness, there was a lot of unknown, there was a lot of education that needed to be done, and things, for the most part, there are some exceptions, have calmed in the county world. In the municipality world, like Richard said, it was all new, and everyone thinks it's investigations only, and that's not, the total role. In fact, that's probably the least role of what we're doing these days. And so, I think time, and as we're seeing in just a short period of time, we only took the municipalities June 1st, that things are already starting to calm, and we're out there educating as much as possible. We put a lot of information on the website. The cities are hopefully doing their due diligence in getting people to go to that website. So, I think it's moving in a very forward progress, and time is a wonderful thing in some respects, and I think everyone's starting to, for the most part. You're going to have your few that aren't going to be happy no matter what we do, because we are shedding the light on things that wouldn't necessarily have been known before. But that's part of the territory of what we do. But we're all seeing it as forward progress, and a lot of positives are coming out of it.
All right, now the next section is committee discussion, but I think we've been having that for the last 20 minutes.
Did you finish your presentation? Oh,
Yes, sir.
okay.
Could I just ask?
Yes.
Again, we're an all-volunteer group on this end of the table. And, it was never part of our portfolio to be management or to be involved in human resource activities. We were part of the selection committee, and I know the ordinance now has us as a review committee, but I still think the county does what the county does, and we shouldn't be taking on functions that already exist and are part of the county structure. I don't think that impairs your independence, primarily for the reason that I just don't think a raise here or there is your motivation. So I don't see a problem having the county continue to be what they are, because that's the job that they do. I don't think it should become our job.
All right, anything else from anybody? If not, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Meeting is adjourned.